This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. Preston Sprinkle. Dr. Sprinkle is a New York Times bestselling author, serves as the president of the Center for Faith, Sexuality, and Gender, and is the host of the excellent Theology in the Raw podcast. His brand new book, Exiles, The Church in the Shadow of Empire, attempts to lay a biblical foundation for a Christian political identity, and it is this book that we will be discussing on the show today. Dr. Preston Sprinkle, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thanks for being on. I'm a big fan, so it's an honor to hear your voice and be on your show right now.
Well, man, I've been really excited about this one. The book is incredible. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
Yeah, I'm 48 years old, married, got 4 kids. I got saved at 19, became a Christian, and just absolutely fell in love with studying the Bible. So that launched me into pursuing several degrees in theology and Bible. Taught for several years at a Christian college, another Bible college, and then the last several years I've been more kind of scattered, really, doing a lot of, I help run a nonprofit. Theology in the Raw has become its own kind of ministry. That's another kind of ministry that I help run. The podcast has grown, and then I just do a lot of independent speaking, writing, and research as well. So it's pretty cool, man. I feel like I can wake up every day and decide what I want to do for that day for the most part. There's some, always some emails I have to get to that I don't necessarily want to, but yeah, that's my journey in a snapshot. I feel like my life mission is trying to take all of our presuppositions, thoughts, passions, and take them back to the Bible to ask, what does the Bible actually say? That's been kind of the vibe of everything I try to do in life.
Yeah, well, I love that. You are, again, a biblical scholar, and that's why I'm really excited to have you on the show. And you're one whose work very much aligns with my philosophy and my outlook on politics. And your new book, Exiles, is extremely timely. And it's an excellent book. What motivated you to write that book?
Well, I feel like I needed to, and I needed to do it, publish it this year, because for years I've been using the phrase exiles in Babylon, and I'll say cheeky stuff on social media. Like I remember, I think the night before the last election, I said, "Hey, tomorrow Babylon's going to elect its new leader," and like just stuff like that. That like I know it's going to get a rise, and people could read into it whatever they want. So I was like, I probably need to fill this out a little bit. Now I've been thinking about kind of a biblical theology of a political identity, if I want to put it like that. I've been thinking about that for a while, but I've never really stepped back and really done all the research and really, until you write something down, it's not airtight. And so that's what I try to do in this book. And so yeah, it's as you know, it's like 80% just kind of biblical theology, and then I do try to like, all right, so what does this mean for today, and offer some points of application. So but I'm excited, but nervous to see how it's going to be received. And not everybody's going to like it like you do.
Yeah, well, and that's always the problem when you write a book on politics. It's always a little bit polarizing, especially in today's political climate. But the title itself really is really good. Exiles, the Church in the Shadow of Empire. Exiles, of course, being like the main title. What's significant about that word exile? Like, how does that relate to the theme of your book?
Well, yeah, I do try to build a theology around exile. So I do go deep into the actual exile, or before the exile, what was the nation of Israel like? And how did that concept of exile affect how early Christians viewed their political identity vis-a-vis the Roman Empire? And how does that participate in how just believers across the biblical storyline view themselves as they were interacting with and oftentimes living under the power of various empires on the earth. So the word itself, sometimes people critique me saying, well, Christians are never called exiles. There's that one verse in 1 Peter or whatever, but it's not like a significant identity. And that's, it's not, it's in Hebrews, it's in Peter. I think that's in a few other places that people don't sometimes realize. The book of Revelation as a whole kind of has that concept there. But I do think rather than the amount of times it occurs in the New Testament, I think the concept of living in an alternative political identity in the face of other earthly kingdoms, man, I just think that lens is I mean, makes sense of everything in the New Testament. I think it's very, very pervasive. I think there's a lot more in the Bible, the biblical storyline, that contributes to how we even view ourselves as a political entity, the church, the kingdom of God, against these various political entities. So, yeah, I think the concept is much more pervasive than simply like how many times the word exile occurs in the New Testament.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And like a lot of words in the Bible, the word exile is very complicated. And if you went to any church in the United States and pulled a random person out of the pew, you get 100 people, and they probably all give you a different definition of that term. And it's the same thing for loaded words like the gospel and justification. There are all kinds of words and concepts that there's no consensus on within American Christianity. One of those words that's not always obvious to people is the word political itself. And you try really hard, I think, to nail that down in a productive way at the beginning of your book. So what is challenging about the word political for Christians, and what do you mean when you use that term?
Yeah, I think so. Political. Yeah, I think when people say political, they often mean something like partisan. The gospel is not political or whatever. And what they mean is like, well, the gospel is not about being a Democrat or Republican, and I can get on board with that, but that's not really what the term political means. On a general level, political just has to do with, in general, how any community or society sort of organizes itself around questions like resources, leadership, citizenship, and immigration. How, who can be in our group, and on what grounds can they come into our group? So when the United States asks that question, they're thinking of borders and people coming in, and on what grounds can they come in, and what does it mean to be a citizen? Well, the church has similar questions too. How should we treat the immigrant? How should we even view ourselves as sojourners in a foreign land? Leadership. The church, the Bible has a lot to say about what kind of leadership reflects the way of Christ. All the way back in the Old Testament, we have statements about how kings were to rule over Israel, and it's very different than how the other kingdoms were to rule over, or how the different kings were to rule over their kingdoms. Economics is obviously a very significant political category. Well, the Bible has a ton to say about economics, and the New Testament itself talks a lot about resources, and what do you do when somebody doesn't have access to resources or is lacking in resources? What do you do when somebody has excessive resources? Like very similar questions that we often think are just like political out there, nation state questions. Well, these are also profoundly theological questions that I think the church should wrestle with. So I do, early on in the book, I define political in that more, I don't think it's a broad sense. I just think it's an accurate sense. But people might, interpret it that way, that I'm not just talking about, who to vote for, and, is building the wall good or bad? It's like, okay, those are not unimportant, but those aren't ultimate. Those, you can't reduce political questions to kind of the discourse that's been controlled by the typical mainstream, conversation.
Well, those are two really important points. And the theme of exile and the theme of politics, as you just described it, work its way throughout all of Scripture. And again, one of the things that I really appreciate about your book is that you are a biblical scholar. And so you spend the majority of the book just kind of giving the biblical case for the way that the concepts of exile and politics work their way out in the Bible. And I want to walk through that today. Another thing that I want to say up front that I really like about your book, that I think is different from when other biblical scholars have written on politics, is that even though there are a lot of biblical scholars that are out there that write on politics that say that they don't pick a side, it's very obvious when you're reading their book that they're clearly trying to read one side of the political aisle into the text. And I don't get that sense from your book. You do a very good job of genuinely trying to wrestle with these concepts in the Bible, and you start all the way back in the Old Testament. And one of the first points you make in your book is that Israel as a nation was supposed to be distinct or separate from the people around it. And I think a lot of American Christians, okay, they understand, yes, obviously Israel is different because they worship different gods, and that's kind of where it ends. But in this book, you say, no, it's a lot more radical and a lot more fundamental than that. So in the Old Testament, Israel, the people of God, how are they distinct from the nations that surround them?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And that you hit the nail on the head. When people think Israel being distinct, they often just reduce it to, well, they worship, they were monotheists and everybody else was pagan. They worship other gods, and they reduce it to kind of the spiritual distinctiveness. But Israel as a socio-political entity was radically distinct. I picked 4 categories to kind of illustrate that. These aren't the only categories, but they're pretty significant. One is kingship, that the very nature of how God desired a king to rule over Israel was radically distinct from other nations. Don't amass wealth, don't make political alliances, don't build a standing army or be militaristic, be humble, like all these things. It was just like, it's almost like God looked at how kings of the other nations were and just said, okay, don't do that. Do the opposite. And you almost see if you play sort of Deuteronomy 17, the sort of law of the king, where God lays some of this out, off against 1 Samuel 8, where the nation of Israel ends up saying, we want a king like the nations, where they're basically saying, we want a non-Deuteronomy 17 king. And then, Samuel describes what that king's going to be like. And so, and it's not good. So yeah, kingship's just radically different. The whole economic system, where the power of cultivating wealth was put in the power of the hands of the people. I mean, just the land allotment. Again, we often just say, oh yeah, they settled and they kicked out all the Canaanites, settled the land, and they divided the land, everything. And we often just kind of don't think about the radicality of the political implications of that, partly because we're just not steeped in ancient Near East literature. But to say that the common person, the peasant, has rights to this land and the kings and the priests can't say a word, and if they do try to mess with this peasant's land, they're going to get rebuked from the mouthpiece of God. Like that's just not in almost every other culture. The king owned everything. The king can take whatever he wants. The priests owned land. It was kind of the good old boys, the elites at the top that kind of controlled everything. So that's radically different. Militarism. We often just get thrown off by the violence in the Old Testament. Sure, there's lots of violence. Some of it, I would say, is even commanded by God, and there's, that's another complicated question. But militarism, building military might, is always ruthlessly condemned in the Old Testament. So is imperialism. In fact, there's a great article that was written on the whole census that David took. David took a census, and God condemns him as like, well, counting your people is like, we always get thrown off. Like, why was that wrong? But if you look into actually what he was doing there, he was building a standing army to advance the borders. Like, there was an imperialistic, quest going on there, and God slaps him on the hand. I'm going to put it lightly, and says, how dare you build an empire? So imperialism, militarism is critiqued, even if there are some allowances of violence. So these are just various lenses that say, even when Israel was a nation state, they were to be such a backwards nation state that it didn't even look anything like the other nations on a socio-political level. And then you see some of those upside down kingdom values kind of bleed into the New Testament when we start talking about the kingdom of God spread among the nations.
And that idea of separateness was baked into the cake. I mean, you have those great statements in Leviticus that, you should be holy because God is holy. And that's really what that means, is that, like, from the beginning, Israel was not supposed to look like the people that were around them.
Socio-political holiness. That's something I just don't. Christians that sometimes get wrapped up into partisan politics and this and that. Like, there's a socio-political separateness that has a moral quality to it. And that's something I kind of want to alert readers too, that there's strong biblical precedent for considering those things. So, like, when your favorite politician who is against abortion and is for this and for that, what is kind of resonating with a lot of your values, is he or she pursuing leadership and power in a way that resonates with the upside down nature of God's kingdom? And the answer is going to be flat out no. You have to, like, amass a ton of wealth and spend millions of dollars to get elected and tear down your enemy and condemn them and find dirt. It's just all these Babylonian means by which they're trying to get into a position of power. And it's like, sometimes we're just kind of blind to, like, that's very immoral. Like, adultery is wrong, murder is wrong. And guess what? Like, abusing power in that way is also very wrong. It goes directly against the storyline of Scripture.
Well, and I want to ask you this too, because, and maybe this is just my perception, and maybe it's just the kind of churches that I was brought up in. But I remember when I was younger and I heard stories from the Old Testament, they were never told within the entire narrative of the Old Testament. And they almost always were just designed to have some sort of, like, moral or theological message that I could easily pick up and take away from it. And so I think that there are a lot of people, and maybe I'm wrong on this, and that's why I want to get your opinion, but I think that there are a lot of American Christians that kind of almost have, like, a cartoon cartoonish understanding of the Old Testament. Like, okay, yeah, they talk about Babylon and sin and all that stuff, but it's not like the Soviet Union of the United States. Like what we're dealing with in the 21st century is real, where there's almost kind of like an esoteric or cartoonish character to the Old Testament. And so we don't take the narrative and what's happening in those narratives in the Old Testament seriously. I mean, do you get that vibe too, or is that just maybe the way I was raised?
Oh no, I would say 100%. I mean, I taught Old Testament survey in a college for years, really 10 years, I think. And so that was my favorite. Gosh, I just loved opening up students' eyes to the coherency and relevancy of the Old Testament storyline. I think most Christians, they typically camp out, or Christian leaders, pastors will typically camp out on the New Testament and then maybe reach for the Old Testament as kind of like an illustration. Let's go look at Joshua and Caleb, see they're faithful, and Paul talks about faithfulness, and here's an example from the Old Testament. Or we read the Old Testament just like through a moral lens. Like, let's look at David and Joshua and Nehemiah, and sometimes they'll even smuggle in like Samson and Solomon, who are not moral at all. But here let's look at an example of how to be a good person. And I don't know. I absolutely, that's pervasive. And whose fault is that? I think people mean well and stuff, so I don't. But yeah, I mean, if you really strap on a different lens and just look at the Old Testament through this, as a narrative, and really just broadening your scope of questions you're even asking, there are profound, just again, socio-political points that are embedded in there. I taught a upper level class on Isaiah once, and was forced to kind of really comb, like, what is this book all about? And man, that book is there's so much political theology in that book, and like there's these one line, these refrigerator verses that people latch onto, and those are beautiful and good and everything. But man, there's like, stuff about political alliances and relying on military strength, and like, it's all kinds of themes that are just so relevant on a socio-political level. So, I don't know what the solution is. Just read the Bible more and maybe teach it more comprehensively. But yeah, there's so much there. There's so much in the Old Testament.
No, and that was perfect, because that really sets up my audience for the next question that I want to ask you about, like really one of the main storylines in the Old Testament. And that was like the first time that I read through the Old Testament from start to finish was my sophomore year of Bible college. I dipped in and out of it before then, but I never just read it front to back. And I was absolutely blown away at how much of the Old Testament describes just how badly Israel fails to follow God's commands. And that is a very important theme in your book. So Israel is supposed to be set apart from the nations that surround it, but it fails over and over again. So walk us through that failure. How is it that Israel fails to be the people that God called them to be?
Well, they fail on a moral level, which, I mean, you can go to, many passages. We can go to Deuteronomy 27 and 28, where you have the blessings and the curses of the covenant. That's where you kind of had God, it's almost like a wedding ceremony. Here's like the commitments you're making. It's like, if you do these things, you'll be blessed. If you don't do these things, you'll be cursed. And the rest of the storyline of Scripture, from Deuteronomy, to Exile, is basically a narrative of Israel largely failing at living out the covenant stipulations. But again, those sins are sometimes individual and moral, and other times very socio-political, making alliances with other nations, being militaristic, or King Ahab stealing the land of Naboth's, taking Naboth's vineyard, asserting his political power over a person and taking his land rights, and he gets rebuked. Even things like David in his committing adultery, like, that is a sexual sin. It's also kind of a political, like, he's using he's abusing his power as well. It's a both and, sexual sin and abuse of power. So again, if we, like, the sins of Israel, or even economic sins, are one of the main ones, my word, the elites using their power to get their way, and trampling on the necks of the poor and the marginalized and people that don't have power. And sorry, I just went to like modern day politics and how often that happens. And again, Christians just kind of don't even care or whatever. Or like, we look at the 84, is it 84? So one study says 64, covert, sometimes overt regime changes that the U.S. has been involved in, which is,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sorry to laugh, but which has led to the death and misery and famine of millions and millions of innocent civilians around the world. It's like, yeah, but we got wealthy out of it, Guatemala, well, whatever. So I just, there's just connecting those dots is just exciting to me. And I think it's so necessary to see the things that Israel did wrong. Sometimes we celebrate because our favorite political party is like totally into that or just doesn't even talk about it or something. So yeah, sorry yeah. Sometimes I chase down thoughts in my head and it might take us in a way.
No, I mean, I think that was absolutely correct. And again, like this goes to the heart of your book, and it's something that every Christian needs to be aware of. We should be drawing those parallels from Israel's failure to the political policies that we support today, because there is, again, human nature being what it is. People are still doing the exact same thing today that they were doing in antiquity, except now we have like nuclear weapons technology and the ability to kill people on a scale that the kings of Israel and Babylon never could have dreamed of.
Yeah. Our imperial power is way more pervasive.
I know. Well, and that's always something that I found kind of funny, especially about like more of the like progress, like the Richard Dawkins kind of critique of the Old Testament. And I know Richard Dawkins is English, but his government participated in the War on Terror too. And they talk about like the slaughter of the Canaanites, which again, it's a very complicated historical story. However, the War on Terror has killed at least 4.5 million people in the Middle East, and his government was responsible for that. You don't hear much of a critique of that from them. They'd rather, but that's a great parallel. You talk in your book too about how, again, going back to the Deuteronomy 27 through 30 thing, that God's whole covenant with Israel is that if they're faithful, they'll remain in the land and his promises will come to fruition through them. But if they're not, they are going to be punished and they're going to go into exile. And that's really what like 2 Kings and the prophets are all about. Israel fails and God punishes them because that was the covenant he had with them. You have a really great chapter on this in your book. And this is really kind of a pivotal chapter where you talk about the exile and how the exile really is like a major political turning point for the people of God. And it doesn't necessarily reframe the way that they think about politics, but it nuances it in ways that wasn't there before. So walk us through that. How does the exile impact God's people, and how does that shape the way that they think about politics and how God is going to relate to the political realm?
Yeah, that's good. I look at it. I look at the exile through three lenses. Well, I mentioned three lenses: theological, historical, and political. Theologically, exile was punishment for ongoing disobedience. If you do these things, you will live in the land. If you don't do these things, I will spew you out of the land. Right. And so they didn't do these things. They didn't do the law sufficiently, and so they were spewed out of the land, taken away to exile. So that's kind of the theological covenantal framework. Historically, obviously, it was just a brutal massacre of a bunch of civilians, and it was temples torn down, it was families being slaughtered, it was people being chained up or whatever and dragged across the desert to Babylon to serve the needs of Babylon. But also I camp out on this third lens, this political lens, that Israel was this kind of for lack, is anachronistic, but I mean, church and state were one. It was a nation with all these kind of it was managing the land and running the land and everything. It was also a spiritual entity. Now that political sort of claim to the land, that was stripped away through exile. So even when they return back to the land 70 years later, they're still under the power of another nation state, a kingdom, an empire, Persia. And they're kind of awaiting for the Messiah to come and sort of rebuild the kingdom. But then even through the end of the Old Testament, especially in the New Testament, and between the Testaments, really, you begin to see like, oh, I don't know if this Messianic kingdom is gonna come anytime soon, or maybe it's not going to come in the way we expect it. So you see like you see this kind of political, if I can say, political restoration sort of hanging in the air when the Old Testament closes. And then it gets just redefined in the New Testament. Jesus comes on. He is the Messiah. He is the Davidic king. He is using all these very profound political categories like kingdom and son of God, and even preaching the gospel, which is a very political term, as I point out in the book. But he's not rebuilding a new nation state. He is rebuilding a kingdom of a multi-ethnic kingdom that is scattered among the nations as an alternative set of political policies to cities, communities. So, if you take the kind of various first century Jewish views on what does restoration look like, you have the Sadducees that sort of like conform to Rome. They're like, well, this Messiah thing isn't come about. The best we can do is just kind of join, be patriots, right? and join the forces of Rome. The Pharisees and Zealots, they're a little bit more the revolutionaries. Like, no, we need to, let's resist Rome and wait for a time to actually do what the Maccabees did for a little bit and rebuild the actual kingdom through violence, and rebuild this Davidic kingdom. And Jesus kind of he doesn't fit into any one of those categories. Or of course, you have the Essenes who kind of said, we're just going to escape the whole thing and go live by the Dead Sea and wait for God to sort all this out. And Jesus doesn't really fit into any of those categories. He does build a kingdom. He does not join Rome, but he's also starting a violent revolution. But it's also, and here's the thing I really want to make clear in the book, and this isn't, in biblical studies, this isn't that radical. I think among it's kind of in the pews, it might seem a little radical, but like when Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world, or when he even talked about the gospel of the kingdom, he wasn't talking about just Jesus's invisible, immaterial reign in our individual hearts. There was something very earthy and tangible and political about it. This might be one of the main arguments in the book is trying to show that like this thing called the ecclesia, the church, as outposts of kingdom of heaven, is a tangible political entity. We're not just a gathering of believers who have Christ reigning in our hearts, that where there's no sort of intersection with the politics around us. We are forming political communities that are submissive to the nations around us, but we're also subverting those nations around us too. Like there is an opposition here. The Babylons of the world today are trying to rule God's world in a way that is offensive and wrong and bad and is going to be judged. And we are forming alternative political communities in a way that is competing with these kingdoms of the world, even while we are being submissive and obedient. Well, submissive and I guess you could say obedient to the nations that we're living under. Sorry, that's long-winded response, but
no, that was actually perfect. And I was going to ask you about Jesus next. So give us some concrete examples. How does Jesus' teaching serve as a rebuke towards empire or critique of empire? And I think again, too, not just like a lot of people and a lot of anti-imperial scholars will look to Jesus and they see his teaching as a critique of the Roman Empire. But I think that, and I think your book, draws this out in some pretty nuanced ways. It's also a critique of attempted Jewish empire as well.
Yes.
So in what ways is Jesus's vision of the kingdom of God a critique of the way that human beings conceptualize empire?
That's a great, yeah. Oh my gosh. I have a couple chapters on that. And, Jesus's initial, I would say, historical context is within Judaism, in the Gospels, it feels like Rome is sort of in the background. They're kind of there, they're hanging out. But Jesus is really dealing with Judaism, Jewish leaders, different Jewish visions of the kingdom. And that's mostly correct, I think. But I don't think it's entirely correct. I think it is a bit of a both and. I think he is primarily dealing with competing Jewish views of the kingdom. What I was already talking about, the revolutionary view, the sort of accommodation view, the isolationist view, and he's kind of interacting with those options. And again, doesn't fit in any one of them, which is why when the Herodians and Sadducees and Pharisees keep kind of dragging him into these kind of partisan debates, which has a lot of parallels to today, he just constantly is just resisting it. He's like, I'm doing something different. I don't fit along your political grid of left, center, right, to use an anachronistic, but helpful, I think, an important analogy. But you do see, this is something my main area of expertise is in first century Judaism. So my kind of Jewish lens is always up and on. But it wasn't until recently when I started to see, well, there's actually some, I think the Roman Empire is playing more of a significant role than we sometimes give room to. Even like you take something like the birth of Jesus, where, Luke chapter 2, you have the whole story of the birth of Jesus is prefaced by the mention of Caesar Augustus and, the governor Quirinius and all these things. Like, well, who cares? Like, what does that have to do with the birth of our personal Savior? And it's like, well, Luke's situating the birth of the Son of God, which is a title applied to the Caesars that were considered divine. He's situating the birth of Jesus right in the framework of these political leaders to show that he is not just doing his thing completely separate from these political leaders, but he is being born as a king against the backdrop of these other, rulers that are trying to rule the world. The temptation narrative, sometimes we pass over where, Satan offered him the kingdoms of the earth, and he said, no, I'm building my own kind of kingdom that's different than that. I'm not going to worship you. And I think that was a genuine offer, because all throughout scripture, we have this pretty thick theme of the kingdoms of the earth being sort of influenced by and sometimes co-opted by demonic powers. We see it right in Daniel 10 and Revelation 13. And I would say even Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, the whole like king of Tyre is Satan. It's kind of like yes and yes, So there's another incident. I was it Mark 5, where you have, sorry, I just got some notes over here. I'm looking over. Yeah, this is interesting. I didn't even realize, but like the whole casting out of these demons, and they go and indwell a bunch of pigs, and they run off the cliff, and we're like, that's weird. Like, what's going on here? Well, he's in Gentile territory, the east side of Galilee. So there's lots of Romans there, lots of Roman soldiers. And the demon says his name is Legion. And for some reason, I never even made the connection until I started doing more study into Roman Empire. It's like, well, that is the term for the Roman military unit. And it just so happens that, and I did not know this until I did research for the book, that one of the mascots for various legions of the Roman Empire was a pig. So he's in Gentile territory with his tons of Roman soldiers. You got a demon that says he's identifying with the Roman military. And, Jesus casts him out, showing his divine authority over the demon. And I would say there's a whisper of, and the Roman military, like I think it is a subtle kind of middle finger, spiritual middle finger to this extension of the kingdom of Rome that thinks it's going to overpower people by military might. And Jesus is kind of like thumbing his nose up about at that a little bit. So there's just little subtle things like that if you kind of try to put yourself in the sandals of a first century reader, it's like, oh, there's stuff going on here where there's these kind of subversive messages being made about the Roman Empire, even while Jesus is submitting to the power of the empire.
Another really good example in the New Testament where you claim in your book that a writer is being anti-imperial is in Paul, and you claim that Paul's gospel is counter-imperial, and there's been a lot of work that's been done on this over the last decade or 15 years or so. For my audience that might not be familiar with like more academic biblical studies and theological debates, the debate over the meaning of the gospel is absolutely vicious. And it is a very, very contentious issue, but I think you do a very good job of articulating your point. So walk us through that. How would you define the gospel for the Apostle Paul? Because it is like, regardless of how you define it, everyone agrees that it is central to Paul's thinking. Like this is the gospel is at the heart of Paul's worldview. So how do you define the gospel? And then how would that be for Paul within his historical context, a challenge to Roman imperial ideology?
Yeah, good. Defining the gospel is as simple as a question it is. That's complicated. Again, as a biblical studies guy, I like to roll up my sleeves and just roll around in the text for a while. So the Greek word euangelizomai, the verb, is used I think only 4 times in the Old Testament. All 4 times is in the second part of Isaiah 40 to 55. Which is it's a profoundly political section. And when euangelizomai is used, so I think the first time is in Isaiah 40, verse 9 to 10, where Isaiah says, here is your God, see the sovereign Lord comes with power. He rules with a mighty arm. It is called, this is the one who brings good news to Jerusalem. The good news is the announcement that even though you are sitting there in exile, even though the temple's been destroyed, even though it seems like all these pagan gods are actually ruling the world through the kingdom of Babylon, Yahweh still reigns. And at one point in the future, he will manifest that reign in a real tangible way. And you see that throughout the second half of Isaiah. So I do think that the New Testament use of euangelion, euangelizomai, is drawing on that kind of announcement of the kingship of Yahweh from Isaiah, which already has political connotations, obviously, but it also was widely used. Euangelion, euangelizomai, euangelion's the noun, euangelizomai, the verb, was often used to announce something about the reign of the Caesars of the day who consider themselves divine, sons of God and lords of the world. There's a famous inscription that was scattered throughout Asia Minor. The main one's found in a town called Preen, that uses the term gospel to announce the birth of Caesar Augustus, who brought good news and peace to the kingdom. So if you read that inscription, it feels like it's straight out of the Bible. And that's because Christians, I would say, deliberately used shared political vocabulary to talk about the reign, the kingship and kingdom of Jesus. King, son of God, kingdom, gospel, even peace, the Pax Romana. Well, the New Testament talks about the peace of Christ, who is king. So these were, I think, designed, this shared political language was designed to send a subtle message, which we often say, right? If Jesus is Lord, then Caesar is not. What does that mean for today? I think at the very least, it should just at least tweak how we view our political identity as a member of the multi-ethnic global kingdom of God spread among the nations. How are we to navigate that identity in light of the various kingdoms that we happen to be born into? At the very least, I think our identity needs to be separated a bit more. We need to be good citizens, submit to government authorities, pray for the leaders of the nation we happen to be born into. And that applies equally to all Christians scattered amongst the nations. So, So I think it does have, I think it has practical implications for how we view our political identity among the nations.
I want to ask you. I want to ask you more of a scholarly question here, and this might be completely selfish. And if you're in my audience, you're not interested in this. I'm sorry. But one of the things that really got me thinking about politics was when I was in Bible college. It was I started in 2007, and I have a degree in biblical studies, as I've said 1,000 times on the show before. And I've also said that this is right about the time that Paul and anti-empire scholarship was becoming really prominent. And so back then, I was reading like John Dominic Crossan and N.T. Wright and Richard Horsley. And I'm trying to Neil Elliott. Like there were a lot of those scholars that were writing within that vein, and they were very, very concerned in their scholarship to show that Paul was explicitly being subversive in his letters. And so they wanted to make Paul into kind of this political radical. And of course, the debate has become more and more nuanced as the years have gone on. I had Christoph Heilig on my show about a year ago to talk about his book, The Apostle and the Empire, where he tries to nuance that conversation by saying, that maybe it wasn't always dangerous to criticize the Roman Empire. And maybe Paul's not really trying to be subversive. Maybe sometimes he just criticizes the Roman Empire out loud, and you were kind of allowed to do that. So adding some nuance to that conversation. And I've recently been reading a lot of work by Najib Hadid, which is a scholar, or Haddad, I think. And I got him scheduled for my show here at the end of next month. But he's written a couple of really good books that kind of criticize the Paul and Empire perspective. And his whole paradigm is that for Paul, it's really the new creation, and the Roman Empire is kind of on the periphery of Paul's thought, as something that would just be done away with in the old creation and the eschaton. So I was wondering where you're at on that whole Paul and Empire scholarship debate, because I'm somewhere now between Haddad, with respect to Paul at least, I'm somewhere between Haddad and Heilig, where I think that they both make very compelling points, and I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm kind of actually in limbo, I guess, with my. So I wanted to get your perspective on that debate. Where do you fit into that, and where do you think that debate's headed in scholarship?
Okay, thank you for that question. I love this question. I'm glad you asked it. And let me just lay my cards completely out.
I love it.
There's a spectrum, right, of how much of the New Testament, and Paul in particular, is counter-imperial, all the way from not at all. I know John Barclay is skeptical of it, all the way to this is everything. Richard Horsley.
Right.
Oh, there's another guy I had on my podcast, the Australian guy, Warren Carter. Where would I be on that spectrum? I would be closer to the Richard Horsley's, Warren Carter's, N.T. I would be similar to where N.T. Wright is. I don't think he goes as far as some, but I think he's, as I see him arguing for a counter-imperial nature of the gospel, I think it's largely, from what I can tell, correct. So I'm probably 70, 80% on that side. I will say this, though. In the book, it sounds like I'm like 100% on that side. Right. And that's, for good or for ill, I'm trying to introduce that conversation to a popular audience. And so I might emphasize these sort of counter-imperial themes more than I would if I wrote a scholarly book. I'd probably be a little more careful, but I'm just trying to introduce these themes to an audience that may have no clue about them, maybe no category, So, in the book, it's going to feel like I'm 90%, 100% on that side. If you're going to really pinch me on it, I'd probably be, it sounds like maybe similar to where you are. So I think Scott McKnight he's got a very healthy approach from what I can tell. And even the book that he helped edit, if Jesus is Lord, Caesar is not. I thought that's there were a lot of critical pieces of the counter-imperial, or at least somewhat critical. So here's the one thing that I don't like with that scholarship is there's kind of a joke going around that, every time there's a Republican in office, here comes all the counter-imperial, works. And it's like, I just think that's profoundly wrong-headed. And so this is where, I want to say empire is empire, and it's a very bipartisan problem. It's not just, as I described to somebody, the right side of the empire, the political right side, they just say the quiet part out loud. Like them, it's just like right there in your face. But all you have to do is peek behind the curtain, and you see a lot of the same stuff on the left. You see elitism, you see lying, you see foreign policy where we will, look at just Obama's droning campaign, or Hillary Clinton. One of the hawkish politicians that we've ever had. She would rival, George W. II, or even Reagan, or it's just So I when I read counter-imperial stuff, I'm like, if I can tell who you're going to vote for, then I think that's problematic, So, and most of the time you can't tell, who they're really trying to attack there. So,
right. Well, I think New Testament scholar Nick Perrin, I think he had this joke one time where he was talking about the Jesus seminar in the 1980s, and I think his joke was like the only thing that you could get out of the historical Jesus from the Jesus seminar was that he would have been an environmentalist and he would have voted against Ronald Reagan. And I think that's completely accurate if you look at the historical Jesus that was produced by the Jesus seminar. And I think a lot of people do that with Paul too. And I definitely see that there's a lot of room for nuance, and it's a very interesting debate. Even if like Najib Haddad is right, and the Roman Empire for Paul was on the periphery of his thought. Now, I wouldn't go as far as he would in that, but even if you accept that, you still have to deal with all of the apocalyptic literature in the Bible, and you have to deal with the book of Revelation, which is explicitly anti-imperial. There's no way of getting around that in the book of Revelation. And so walk us through that. Now, the book of Revelation has been the staging ground for all kinds of just wild theological conspiracy theories, and all throughout church history, whether you go back to, the Reformation with Martin Luther having questions about the book of Revelation, or even to the early church fathers, where there were really debates about whether or not the book of Revelation should be included. It has been a very difficult work in the history of the church, and it's been used for a lot of radically terrible political programs. So walk us through that. How should we interpret the book of Revelation, and then, apocalyptic, which is the genre in which Revelation was written? And what does that tell us about empire?
Yeah. It is unfortunate that the book of Revelation has fallen into the hands of so many people. like on the one hand, yes, there are wildly different modern or even historical interpretations of the book of Revelation. But if you situate it in the context of first century Jewish apocalyptic literature, it actually is not terribly hard to interpret. I don't want to be overly ambitious, but if you look at any serious biblical scholar who studies the book of Revelation, that's very well acquainted with first century apocalyptic literature, their interpretations are largely the same. If you look at N.T. Wright, Michael Gorman, Scott McKnight has a recent book out. You look at I don't know. There's Cindy Westfall has done some work on Revelation that's really good. Then you have some of the more Anabaptist scholar. They all Richard Bauckham is brilliant on Revelation, but they all end up kind of saying the same thing. This is one of the most counter-imperial first century relevant books in the history of literature. This is like, the gloves come off, as somebody says in the book of Revelation. So yeah, I don't the kind of modern day kind of rapture theology stuff, and I don't want to say negative things about that holistically, but that's
I've said a lot of negative things about that on the show. So yeah, you're in a safe space here.
Just from a historical perspective, like a historian looking at ancient literature, that's not what I mean. Go read like the Jewish book Second Baruch or For Ezra, which were written right on the same time of Revelation. They are they are just like kissing cousins. It belongs in late first century Jewish apocalyptic, which by nature was political. You're peeling back the curtain and giving an apocalyptic interpretation of the political events of the day. And so, yeah, I'm glad the way you framed your question was perfect. Even if we take Paul out, even if we say Paul's not counter-imperial at all, the book of Revelation is, I would say, indisputably not only counter-imperial, but it is most relevant because apocalyptic by nature is revealing. Paul's doing his missionary stuff, doing this, and he might have some more subtle subversive statements, but the book of Revelation just pulls the curtain back and says, all right, let's talk politics, directly. So what I think, the book of Revelation is the most relevant book for a political theology. And it just so happens that the book of Revelation agrees with everything I've said so far.
Very convenient.
I mean, a lot of my political theology does kind of come down to, I think, the book of Revelation. And I don't make apologies for that. I think it's designed to do that.
Yeah.
One of the things, so to I guess maybe tap into it a bit, one of the things in the book of Revelation, well, let's see. There's two important features in Revelation. There's many important features, but two off the top of my head that I think are relevant is, number one, the book of Revelation uses the term Babylon as a general category for empire as a whole. Yes, the Roman Empire is primarily in the backdrop, and I could justify this exegetically if you want. The book of Revelation, as Richard Bauckham says, talks about the Roman Empire in a way that's a bit more general. Like, if the shoe fits, then wear it. If you act like Babylon, then you too are Babylon, and you too are subject to the ferocious critiques throughout the book, especially Revelation 17 and 18. So that'd be one point. I think that even going back to like when I say I'm an exile in Babylon, that people are like, America's not Babylon and stuff like that. I actually have exegetical grounds for saying that it is, or at the very least is Babylon-like. So that's one important theme in the book of Revelation. Another one is that the beast, Babylon, Rome, Babylon-like empires have been, at the very least, influenced by, if not co-opted by, the dragon, which is Satan. This comes right out of Revelation 12 and 13, and you can go to 17 and 18. I mean, really, the book as a whole. But there is this marriage between empire, and the devil. and that is a main theme in the book of Revelation. And to me, that is one of my most important points that I want to make towards political theology today. Because when I read contemporary political theology, oftentimes the biggest critique is I just don't know if you have a robust enough theology of empire that is taken seriously in the book of Revelation. So, what does that mean? I mean, that practically, it's tough. It's tough that, does that mean you should be politically involved? Does that mean it's demonically? There's all kinds of routes you can go, but at the very least, I think theologically we should at least start there.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I do think, to your point about reading a lot of modern contemporary political theology, when they say that the book of Revelation critiques empire, what they mean is if they're a Republican, it critiques the policies of the Democrats. And if they're a Democrat, it critiques the policies of the Republicans. They don't really mean it critiques empire. They mean it critiques the other side of the political spectrum. It's very unfortunate that happens. We got a couple minutes left here, and I want to get to the end of your book. You offer some suggestions suggestions for how we should handle the exegesis that you do in the earlier parts of your book in the modern church. And you say that there are basically three approaches to Christian engagement with empire. The first is detachment, the second is transformation, and the third is prophetic witness. And you give examples of how Christians have done all three of these. So walk us through those positions, and which one do you think the church should embrace?
Right. Yeah. I do want to give a shout out to Nilay Saya. He's an Indian scholar who teaches in Singapore and wrote a brilliant book called The Global Politics of Jesus. And I definitely credit him. I didn't plagiarize him, but I kind of follow his kind of framing of these things very, very closely. And he's you should have him on he's awesome. He's great political theologian. So detachment is kind of the isolationist, like we need to remove ourselves from society. The classic example might be, I guess, the Amish always get kind of the poster child of that, or maybe even, I haven't read it, but who's the Benedict option? The guy who did the Benedict option, I forgot his name. Anyway,
sounds familiar.
Yeah, and I haven't read it, so I don't want to try to represent him. He might resist that label, but just kind of we need to remove ourselves from society. Then there's a transformation view that no, we need to we need to transform society. This comes from more classic Reformed traditions, and I would say some level of transformation is kind of surrounds anybody who is what I would say maybe overly politically involved, or maybe that's a bad way of framing it. Maybe they're giving too much allegiance to partisan politics is maybe a better way of framing it. I think their goal is like, no, we need to make, our nation is, they would use the term our nation. First of all, our nation is needs to become better and more righteous. And they're gonna have different interpretations of what that is. On one end, it might be the Christian nationalists or the progressive left or whatever. Either way, they're trying to reform society. And the third view is a prophetic witness that takes elements of both, but just kind of situates it differently. And I do think the prophetic witness view is, it's a bit Anabaptist. It's a bit, maybe even, you tell me, libertarian. It might be more along those lines. It's suspicious about partisan politics. It's suspicious about empire. It's suspicious about the deep state. And on it goes. This is why, the last several months I've been listening to a lot of libertarians. I'm like, I think you guys are onto something here. but I'm just coming at it just from a theological standpoint. But yeah, so prophetic witness says, whatever civic and political involvement we have, it is always kind of at arm's distance. We're suspicious about getting entangled in the ways of the empire as we're trying to reform the empire. Our involvement, it might be a little more ad hoc, as Lee Camp. He's the first one I heard that phrase from. Jamie Smith uses it too, but ad hoc, it's MLK saying, this is an unjust law. Jim Crow laws are unjust, and I'm going to fight against that. But he does so in a very bipartisan way. He's not like latching onto one political party to fight against the other political party. He's doing so through Christian means. He's using nonviolent action. He's not using the power of Babylon to try to reform Babylon. That doesn't make any sense. And I don't know enough about the civil rights movement to say how much it succeeded in that or not. But so I absolutely see place for Christians doing that. But again, I always want Christians to be suspicious of the ways of Babylon and how it is constantly, very aggressively trying to woo you into its allegiance to the empire. And that's something I just want to resist that. And one thing that I often, going back to the ecclesia, the political nature of the church, like I want to explore how the church as a political community can be the vehicle through which we pursue good in the world. So, and I use some examples of this. For the sake of time, I don't want to get too over my skis here, but
hey, go take it wherever.
Well, so this is a big one. I hate to drop it, but something like abortion. Some Christians will reduce their care of abortion to changing laws. So when Roe v. Wade was reversed, it's like, we won, and now let's make it, let's keep going to make it, a federal law, not just give it to the states or whatever. And it's like, okay, I can, and I know libertarians are maybe divided on this, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, let's just say that was a good thing. Well, let's like deeper at a political question like that. Like 50% of people who get abortions are Christians. Many of them believe it's wrong, but most of them have this choice between, well, I can face profound shame in my church environment for having a kid out of wedlock, or I don't have the means to take care of this child, or I can get an abortion. So I'm just going to go get an abortion. Well, changing the abortion law doesn't change that profound problematic culture. And so there's awesome organizations like Embrace Grace, which is an organization. I just talked to the founder yesterday, and she a beautiful picture of how can we cultivate a culture in the church where if a single mom has to choose between life and abortion, we can create structures from the church where she can choose life. Because if all we do is change laws, that's just not enough. Like there's things the church can do and embody that represents the kind of good we want to see in the world, and it comes to, racism and gun laws and all these things. Like there are creative ways the church can actually embody the kind of society that we want to see in the world. And whatever civic involvement we have should be kind of from that perspective. We're almost like showing the world how it can be done rather than just getting politically involved out there and then just going to church on Sunday while there's all kinds of racism and like militarism and all these things in the church that needs to be rectified.
Yeah, I think that was a beautiful answer. Before we wrap up here, I got to ask you this. So you are, like I said before, you're a biblical scholar. There are going to be a lot of pastors that will read your book and be convinced by your thesis, and a lot of lay people as well. And I know that, like, if I gave your book, which I probably will, to the ministry team at my church, that they would probably agree with most of what you say in the book. But it's very hard when you are in ministry, especially in an election year like 2024, to get people to switch their paradigm for how they think about politics. Even Christians that have been in the church for a long time. So what are some like hermeneutical or exegetical advice that you could give to pastors or church leaders that are trying to wrestle with how they understand this in the Bible and then communicate it to an audience of people that might be completely unfamiliar with these concepts?
That's a great question. I haven't really thought through that specific question. Like how the first thing that came to mind, I guess, would love your thoughts on this too. It's not an exact parallel, but Jesus, we mentioned this kind of in passing earlier. Jesus was constantly trying to be dragged into these, I would say, political alliances with the Herodians, with the Sadducees, with the Pharisees, and he just constantly resisted kind of politics as usual. And it's not an exact parallel, but there's a lot of similarities there. Like I think there's a pastor could actually use some of those. There's many passages in the gospel as sort of a template for how Christians should be aware, be a little more suspicious about, and you could even use terms like, secular society trying to woo you into the party or woo you into allegiance to their way of doing things. Even if you might resonate with certain values in their way of doing things, like just be a little suspicious, like how much of these allegiances can actually compete with and not exist alongside your allegiance to Jesus. That'd be one thought off the top of my head. If you really want to be daring, do a sermon series on the book of Revelation or parts of Revelation and read it through a political lens. That might be a big sermon series, but there's so much, I think, pretty explicit material to work with there in the book of Revelation.
Well, man, I love that. Dr. Preston Sprinkle, this has been an awesome conversation. Give us the final sales pitch for the book. Why should people, besides the fact that making money is good and you have 4 kids that you have to feed, why should people go out and buy and read your book?
One of my goals is that it will help prevent the church from being divided again. We saw it in 2016. We really saw it in 2020. And I think Satan is doubled over laughing when the kingdom of God is divided over which Babylonian leader they want to see elected. I'm not saying one's not better than other. Maybe you have leanings and whatever, But if we take John 17 seriously, Jesus says one of the primary ways to witness that God is true and that Jesus is who he said he is if the people look on and see the church being unified. And if they look on and see a church bickering and backbiting, fighting against each other, yelling at each other, condemning each other, mocking each other, based along political lines that have been drawn by Babylon, we got to do better than that. So I'm hoping that the book will provide biblical, kind of a biblical foundation to go about our political discourses much, much better.
Yeah. Well, man, I really appreciate you coming on the show today. This has been awesome. Before I let you go, where can people find your work and follow you?
Yeah. Well, I was branded well. Preston Sprinkle is a unique name. So if you just Google my name, you'll come across several stuff. But yeah, I've got a website, prestonsprinkle.com. Theology and Raw is my podcast. Website's theologyraw.com. I'm on social media. I don't spend a ton of time there, but Twitter or X is at Preston Sprinkle. Yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah, there's probably other places they can go. But
Dr. Sprinkle, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.